the attendee room.
I sent them their host links.
I know. I know. Let's see if they're coming on.
Tom says we'll be right there.
All right. Great. Did Tom send you a chat?
Yeah, an email.
Oh, okay. Great. Tom says he's on. Excellent. Okay. So we'll wait for them. Thanks everyone for joining us on a Friday afternoon. Great to see you here. We're going to get started in a minute. We're going to get started in just a minute. All right. Messaging with okay. So we will get started in a minute here. All right, so the guy should be here soon. Thanks again, everyone. We're going to get started. We're going to give it a couple of minutes before we get started just to make sure that everyone can hear the beginning of the webinar. We appreciate everyone showing up on a Friday afternoon. All right. Alva, can I send the guys my link?
No, I'm forwarding them their links again.
You're sending them their links again. Okay.
Adam, I'm on. Can you hear or see me?
I can hear you now. There we go. Great.
Okay.
Okay, Tom's here, so we can go ahead and get started. I want to give it time. We're going to give it a couple of minutes just so people have time to log on for another minute. I mean, we're not going to go that long. Okay, fantastic. Okay. Well, why don't we go ahead and get started? And let me introduce myself and everybody else here. So welcome everybody to today's webinar in the series Challenges in Pediatric Neuroscience Research. Thanks for coming on a Friday afternoon. My name is Adam Hartman. I'm one of the program directors in the Division of Clinical Research at the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, which is one of the institutes at the U.S. National Institutes of Health. I'm also a practicing child neurologist and epileptologist. My co-host is Dr. Christy Hardy, who I think most people have met already, a pediatric neuropsychologist, also a program director in the Division of Clinical Research at NINDS. Christy and I have a number of pediatric clinical trials and other human subject studies in our portfolio. We created the series to help investigators overcome some of the challenges that they might face in pediatric neuroscience, including areas including neurology, neurosurgery, psychiatry, psychology, neurodevelopmental disabilities, physiatry, critical care, emergency medicine, pathology, radiology, and pharmacology, just to name a few, and there are many others. The ultimate goal is to improve the quality of care for our patients, but the more proximal goal is to enhance research that will facilitate improvements in practice. Our webinars are targeted to trainees, senior investigators, and even those who are not currently involved in research, hopefully making the pie bigger. So today we're hosting Dr. Tom Cheever and Noam Keren, who are both program staff at NINDS. They will be discussing the new NIH data sharing policies. So first, a few technical notes about the webinar. The session is being recorded, will be transcribed and archived on the NINDS website. Details about where to find the archive version will be posted on social media and professional society listservs and newsletters. There will be a question and answer segment at the end. And so if you want to ask a question, you can click on the Q&A icon on the lower toolbar. I'll moderate the question period. And we also wanted to thank Dr. Alvaracinos from NINDS for all of the technical support in coordinating the webinar, and the NINDS Office of the Scientific Liaison for all of its support and the publicity. So let's get started. Dr. Tom Cheever is the Chief of the Research Operations Branch in the NINDS Division of Extramural Activities. The Research Operations Branch works to identify process efficiencies and streamline business operations for the entire grants lifecycle for both applicants and staff alike in service to the NINDS mission. Prior to joining the Research Operations Branch, Tom was a program director in the neurodegeneration cluster of the Division of Neuroscience at NINDS. And before joining NINDS, Tom was a program director for muscle disorders and therapies at the National Institute of Arthritis and Musculoskeletal and Skin Diseases from 2015 to 2020. But he actually started his NIH career in 2013 as a health science policy analyst and American Association for the Advancement of Science and Technology Policy Fellow at NINDS in our Office of Science Policy and Planning, where he contributed to a number of portfolio analyses, evaluations, and reports. Tom completed his postdoctoral training at the Mayo Clinic and graduate training in biochemistry, molecular biology, and biophysics at the University of Minnesota. Our other guest today is Noam Keren, who is a health program specialist in the Division of Neuroscience Office of the Associate Director. Before joining NINDS, Noam was a scientific project manager at the Foundation for the National Institutes of Health, where he managed the Accelerating Medicines Partnership and Schizophrenia program and engaged in other efforts to advance therapeutic development through innovative public-private partnerships for neuroscience research. Prior to that, he was a science officer supporting a portfolio of CNS and mental health grants at the congressionally directed medical research programs, and he had multiple roles at the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Before joining the National Academies, he conducted research in cognitive neuroscience at the Medical University of South Carolina. He received his master's degree in psychology from Washington University in St. Louis. So with that, I present you Tom and Noam talking about the new NIH data management and sharing policy and how it impacts you. All you guys, thanks.
Thank you. Just making sure you can hear me. Great.
Yep, we're good. We can hear you and see you both.
Wonderful. So thank you so much for the opportunity and inviting Tom and myself to speak to you today. We're glad to share some information about the new NIH data management and sharing policy and how it might impact you and your research. And did my slide move over? Everything working? Great. All right. So as many of you know, the NIH has a long-standing commitment to making the results of scientific research that's funded by the agency widely available. This is not a new policy. It's existed for a while now, but it existed in a more delimited way, affecting only larger grants. The new 2023 NIH data management and sharing policy went into effect recently and covers all grants that are submitted after January 25th, 2023. There are multiple benefits, of course, to sharing scientific data. Ultimately, it facilitates the development and of therapeutics when concerning biomedical data. And data management and sharing policy for NIH really creates a consistent minimum threshold for all research supported by NIH agencies. And we seek to meet both fulfilling the policy in terms of compliance and also the spirit of the policy to enhance scientific research and therapeutic development. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of things, I'd like to share with you kind of the guiding principles that lay behind the NIH 2023 DMS policy. These follow the guiding principles of FAIR, and FAIR stands for findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability. And just to tell you a little bit, for those of you who are not familiar with the FAIR principles, what do those mean? So findability just means we can find the data that you're sharing. And by we, I mean the community, whether it's the patient community or your colleagues and your community of research. So in order for data to be findable, it has to have rich metadata, that is data describing the data associated with it. And the data that's being shared should be associated with a unique persistent identifier. That means that no matter where it travels or wherever you publish your research data, we can always find the research data associated with it, no matter where it's deposited in which repository. Accessibility means that the data can be easily downloaded or used using standard protocols that everybody should have access to, and that it should be readable by humans and machines. And I think the latter part is really important now in the age that we're moving towards machine learning and AI analysis of data. And we also want data from different repositories to be able to be matched together and used. So that's the accessibility part of FAIR. Interoperability refers to using a formal language or vocabulary or references in the data. So basically that one data set can speak to another or could be combined. Different data elements could be used together and combined for either research or for trying to replicate. And reusability means that there's a clear usage of licenses. So that is licensed to use the data that is open-ended. It allows others to reuse the data you've put in for their research purposes, and that domain-relevant community standards are used. And of course, that differs from field to field or from disease area to disease area. The end result, when all this is implemented, is that we have a more rigorous way of managing the data that's derived from NIH-funded research, and we're better stewards of this really valuable resource, and of course, stewards of the public funding. Good data management and stewardship, it's not a goal in itself, but it's a kind of a precondition to support knowledge discovery and innovation. In a way, the DMS policy is a lot like informed consent. It doesn't end once you have a data management plan. It's kind of an ongoing process that continually improves. So onto the specific policy for NIH. What does it apply to? So it applies to all research generating scientific data that's funded by the government, in our case, by NIH or NINDS. It includes, but it's not limited to, the kind of your bread and butter R grants, the Career Development Awards, the K grants, and to SBIR, STTR grants. It also applies to larger research centers. It doesn't apply to every activity that we fund. So for example, the DMS policy does not apply to grants that do not generate scientific data, or to grants like training grants, fellowship grants, or other types of grants like the conference grant that you might be familiar with. I should note that you see the links in the bottom of some of our slides. These take you to the relevant sources with additional information, both on the NIH website and the NINDS website. Of course, you can't click on a presentation, but we hope that to both share these slides with the audience, and also we will provide some QR graphics at the end that you can just point your phone to, and they will take you to these relevant resources. So we talked about which types of grants and activities that NIH funds the policy covers. What type of data does it cover within those grants? So what do we mean by scientific data? So the policy defines scientific data as the recorded factual material commonly accepted in the scientific community as of sufficient quality to validate and replicate research findings, regardless of whether the data are used to support scholarly publications. So it covers several important points here, and we'll go to them and go into more detail a little bit later on in the presentation. I know this is a little abstract, so let's go into some examples that may help understand what this covers. So some examples of what scientific data might include is genomics data. So for example, single-cell RNA sequencing is a type of data that could be broadly shared. Electrophysiological recordings or MRI images, structural, functional, doesn't really matter. Pupillometry, MEG, those types of physiological measures, that's a type of data that can be shared broadly. Also behavioral and cognitive data. So data from wearable devices, which are a growing methodology for collecting data in our field, are included in this. Neuropsychological battery results, clinical scale scores, data derived from video or audio recordings. And really, there's a long, long list. We won't get into each of these, but this is just an example, and you could go in later with a copy of the slides, of just some of the types of data that we encounter here at NINDS that can be shared broadly. Sharing scientific data doesn't mean you share every type of information that you produce during your research study. So for example, some of the data that are not included under the policy are really any type of data that's not necessary or sufficient quality to validate or replicate the research findings. So you do not have to share your lab notebooks. You do not have to share preliminary analyses, completed case reports. Drafts do not need to be shared. Plans for future research do not need to be shared. Peer review, communication with colleagues, physical objects, all of these are not covered. So it's really important to keep that in mind when we talk about the data that needs to be shared and where to share it. This really pertains to a particular subset of the data that your research will generate. And every research project will have certain unique aspects to it. And hopefully by the end of the presentation, we'll help you go through a thought process where you can identify that data that needs to be shared and how to do that without too much trouble. So we covered which types of activities that the NINDS funds are covered by the policy. We touched on what types of data is covered in the policy from those funded activities. And I will touch on the actual meat of the policy, how to comply with it and how to implement it. It's really quite straightforward when you think about it. There are two aspects to this. One, the policy requires that you submit a data management and sharing plan with your award application. And the second part is that you comply with the plan that you submitted and that was approved by your program officer and added to your notice of award. So really two parts, write the plan and then follow what the plan says. So what is this plan that we keep talking about that you have to add with your applications? The plan is really a document that has to cover 6 main elements. And I'll briefly go through those elements and we'll go into a little more detail in the upcoming slides. The first element is data type. You have to identify the type that is going to be preserved and shared in your research. The second element pertains to related tools, software, and code. So we would like to know what types of tools and software are needed to access the data that your research shares. Standards. What are some of the standards, if at all, that are applied to the scientific data and metadata that you're sharing? Are there standards in the field or associated with the methodology which you are complying with the data that you're going to share? Data preservation, access, and timelines. This is an element that we think is very important to understand. The data preservation, access, and timeline elements covers where are you going to put this data that you just identified that you will be sharing with us, and when will this data be available? So shortly, it really asks to know what repository you're putting your data in and when will you put it there. And I'll give you a hint. The second part on when you'll put it there is actually already given to you. So we'll cover that in a minute. Access, distribution, and reuse considerations. This element covers any description of factors that may limit the data access, its distribution or its reuse after you've shared it. And oversight of data management and sharing asks the investigator to lay out the plan they have to ensure compliance with the data management and sharing plan throughout the life of the grant. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tom.
Thanks so much, Noam. So let's go ahead and just talk. So Noam covered the required elements of a plan, and the next slide we wanted to show here is a recommended format for the plan. So NINDS strongly encourages the use of this DMS template that we have a screenshot here and link included in the presentation that was initially rolled out when this policy was been implemented. There are other versions and formats of plans, and you may say different ones based on the institute or center you're applying to, but NINDS strongly encourages using this template. We think it's one of the most relatively straightforward, and by following this, it gives us the best chance to make sure that we have everything that we need to evaluate your plan and make sure that it's compliant with the NIH policy. And just a couple other notes about it is it can be a relatively high level plan. So it's recommended to not exceed 2 pages in length, and really just looking for, providing the information that we need, again, just to evaluate whether the plan meets the requirements of the policy. And so Noam, let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. And in the next couple slides, we wanted to just take a slightly deeper dive into a couple elements of the plan and try to give you some kind of practical tips and guidance for completing this plan in the way, again, that will kind of best meet the goals and needs of the policy. So Noam's already covered kind of what types of data might be included that you'd want to include in that first section of the plan. But on this slide, we want to just touch on the next two elements, so that related tools, software, and code, as well as standards. And one of the first things that we wanted to highlight is a note about metadata, which is an important component within that related tools, software, and code. And we find that this is an element that's often misunderstood by applicants in their plans, and just want to share that, metadata, just by its name, is the data about the data, and at a minimum describes the data being shared, the methodology used to obtain it, and an explanation of the data format. And we wanted to provide a couple examples that hopefully might resonate with you all, such as things like data dictionaries, the context of data collection, the sources used to derive the data, and how it was standardized or normalized. And so we hope that's helpful for at least kind of thinking about the metadata aspect of that related tools, software, and code, as well as standards. We also just want to call out that you may find some special funding opportunities that are solicited through these things called NOFOs, Notice of Funding Opportunity, where they may have specific guidelines of the types of standards that they want you to use, whether it might be things like common data elements or other aspects of that. And so we just want to encourage you to take a look at that at the NOFO. It's usually located in section 4 of that NOFO, which kind of describes any kind of aspects we want you to specifically touch on in your application. If there aren't any guidelines in the NOFO, another thing to really consider about standards is whether your field has any field-specific standards or practices. In some cases, you might find professional societies may publish best practice standards for use in your field. And we encourage you to utilize that because it has the best chance of benefiting your community and the broader community as well. And then finally, just also encourage you to look for NIH and specific institute or center resources. So NINDS, for example, we have a web page on the NINDS implementation of the data management and sharing policy. And on that page, you can find a section where we have some examples of standards, for example, that some of our programs use and may be helpful to you as you develop plans. And let's go to the next slide, please, Noam. All right, then the next element we wanted to touch on, and Noam's already alluded to this a little bit here, is things such as how the data is being preserved, access, and timelines. And one of the big elements of this aspect here is selecting an appropriate repository. And as Noam has introduced here, the big thing here is we're looking for repositories that meet those FAIR principles. So findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. NIH has a lot of resources on this as well. There actually was a guide notice published on NIH's kind of recommendations for what makes a good repository, and really the FAIR principles cover it, but there's more data in that note, more information included in that notice if you're interested. And then next, let's talk about timelines. So as Noam noted, there is a specific requirement of this policy, and that's that the data is shared as soon as possible, but no later than the time of associated publication or end of NIH funding, whichever comes first. And if you have questions about this, your program officer is your great resource for reaching out about that, but that's what the policy defines. And then another question that we often get that's a little bit harder to define is how long does the data need to be shared? And this is a little bit harder to kind of give concrete definitions. In some cases, there can be some aspects related to the repository that you're using, or whether you may have institutional policies at your institute. But preferably, to meet the spirit of the policy, being able to share it for as long as possible is what we're really aiming for. But we at a minimum, something like 3 years is a good kind of minimum level to shoot for. So okay, no, I think we can go ahead to the next aspect here. We did want to just kind of provide a few more details, and again, hopefully practical tips for selecting a repository. And this is an aspect that we get a lot of questions about here at NINDS, and we hope that this might be helpful as you kind of navigate this really important part of the implementation of the policy. And so we've kind of provided a couple kind of tiered steps to help you work through the process. And just starting with you may be aware that even before this current data management sharing policy, NIH had released a genomic data sharing policy related to large-scale genomic generating research. And one aspect to kind of start with is just considering whether that policy, whether your research might fall within that policy, and if so, particularly if you're using things like human data, that actually helps you narrow down the repository because it's likely to be using the dbGaP repository for that that type of data generation. But if not, one of the next kind of steps in this process is again to look at your the notice of funding opportunity that you're applying to. Can't really overstate this enough that a lot of the information that you will ever need to know about what to include in your application, it's there in the notice of funding opportunity. They can be long documents, but highly recommend cruising through that as much as you possibly can. And as I had kind of alluded to before, you may find some special programs have already designated which repository they want you to use. And so that can be a great way of finding out, has it already been defined by NIH or NINDS what repository they want you to use? And there's a couple examples on that last slide. And that's perfect, Noam, go ahead. So moving down from that, there are plenty of opportunities though where a notice of funding opportunity, such as like a parent announcement that you might be applying to for a parent or one, doesn't predefine what repository they're looking for. So in this case, you can look to whether there may be any NIH or even NINDS supported repositories, or also even like domain-specific repositories that would be a good fit for your data. And so, for example, we have a couple examples here. FitBirds, for example, is a wonderful repository for traumatic brain injuries, but we also have places for data just covering the full kind of gamut of the NINDS mission as well. And then moving to kind of the next tier down, we're at tier 4 now. We also encourage you, again, if none of these other options fit, to explore community supported or endorsed repositories to meet your kind of data sharing needs. So we provided a couple links here for a couple initiatives that have helped to kind of collect some of these community supported or endorsed repositories as just, again, another place to look. And we often find that using repositories that your community has already embraced can be a great way of making sure that your data is findable and is able to have the impact that the best impact that it can. And then we're getting close to the end here of kind of different ways to inform your selection of repositories, but another one can be to look at whether your institution has developed a repository. There's a lot of examples of this where different universities or other institutions have decided they're going to establish a repository for their investigators to deposit their data in, that again still meet those FAIR principles. And then finally, you could run into a situation where you have exhausted all these prior options, and in that case, NIH has worked with many different generalist repositories, and these are repositories that basically say we accept a broad range of data across many different fields and disciplines. And again, these NIH endorsed ones, again, meet those FAIR principles to make sure that you're compliant with the policy. So I hope that's helpful in kind of walking you through how to select a repository. And then just moving down to kind of the last element we want to highlight here, which is access, distribution, and reuse considerations. And wanted to just highlight an aspect that, again, we get a fair number of questions about and may be relevant to this community as well, which is kind of considerations for protecting the privacy of research participants when sharing human data. And want to call out a specific notice that the NIH had released shortly kind of before this policy was rolled out that does provide some high-level considerations to help you work through how to best protect the privacy of the research participants. And it's all things that you are likely already considering, but just kind of high-level aspects are to consider, de-identifying the data to the greatest extent possible while still maintaining the scientific utility. Also, really trying to be proactive and thinking ahead about user agreements for transferring data and to communicate limitations as it's being deposited and shared. And then finally, of course, to just understand any applicable legal protections and limitations on disclosure. And again, we'll provide some links to this at the end for more information. And then just to kind of highlight again, many of you may be familiar with this, but just factors to consider in the type of access to repositories. So, these can be grouped into kind of two large buckets: sharing through controlled access, which it can be appropriate when there are explicit limitations on the sharing, where data sharing may pose particular risk to some participants or groups, cases where the data can't sufficiently be de-identified, or whether there may be unanticipated risks, and that's kind of discovered after initial planning. And so, we want to just kind of be clear that there are appropriate uses for that, but we also just do want to try to encourage as much data sharing as possible and as practical and ethical, and that's why we also just want to highlight sharing through unrestricted access in cases where it's explicitly consented for unrestricted sharing, as well as where the data can be de-identified and institutional review finds that unrestricted sharing poses low risk. All right, let's go to the next slide, please, Noam. Another aspect of the DMS policy is an important one, but we're actually not going to cover it in too much detail, but we'll provide more links if you're interested in digging in further, which relates to the budget in order to support your data sharing. And we do want to emphasize that it's really important to, again, be proactive about assessing what is your plan for sharing data? What do you need? And what is that going to cost? And being sure to include that in your application, because NINDS was not able to kind of supplement requests that come later during the post-award period. So it's really important to be prospective about that and plan ahead for that as best you possibly can. And again, we provided a couple of links here for more information as well as FAQs. And thanks, Noam. We do want to just highlight examples of what's kind of allowable cost to budget for, as well as unallowable costs. And so things like curating data, developing supporting documentation, the cost to actually preserve and share the data itself, as well as manage and maintain it. And so, those are examples of allowable costs based on the policy. And do want to also just be explicit that what you're budgeting for in this period actually has to be, the costs need to be incurred during the performance period. So try to take that into account as best you can. And then just also be mindful that there are some unallowable costs based on this policy, such as things that would typically be in indirect costs, as well as the kind of other costs related to research. So again, we're providing more links to NIH has a pretty good website on this policy now and how to best comply with it. I encourage you to check it out as best you can. And then we just got through covering what's required to kind of put together that initial plan. And so that's kind of part one that Noam highlighted. Part two is then complying with that plan. And so just to kind of summarize that a bit, the best that we can kind of hope for is preparing a plan as best you can prior to your application and submit it with your application. And if your application is likely to be funded, NIH program staff will review the plan. And if they have questions or looking for more detail, they will reach out to you and start a dialogue to work through that. And just want to add that, we understand it's not always possible to predict the future and that research plans don't always go according to plan. Things can change. Exactly what will be generated and shared where and when may change just due to the unpredictable nature of research. We understand that, and it's entirely possible that plans may need to change during the process of an award. So there's it's perfectly expected that that's going to come up. The big point that I really want to make sure you are aware of is that it's essential to be compliant with the policy that you reach out prior to making any of these changes to get prior approval from NIH. It's not allowed to make a change and then tell NIH after the fact about it. That's because these are actually terms and conditions in any award that you would receive from NIH. So this is not as scary as it sounds, though. Again, this is what program officers are here for. And so there's kind of two main ways to request this prior approval. If you are getting kind of within a defined period of submitting your annual progress report, you can actually request prior approval right within your progress report. If you had just submitted, or it's 6 months from now before you'll submit that RPPR, but you want to try to make a change in the near future, you can always work with your institutional officials to submit a prior request through ERA Commons, and NIH program staff will review that along with grants management staff and others, and we can work with you to address that prior approval request. All right, Noam, I think we can go to the next slide, please. And I think that's all that we have kind of prepared to try to summarize the policy. So again, wanted to provide some QR codes here for additional links that we've alluded to throughout the presentation. And just, yeah, are very interested in trying to help address as many questions as we can. We know this is a new policy. There's a lot to it, but I think, we just encourage you to check out the resources that are out there now. There are a lot of them. And then again, NIH program staff are ready to try to address things not covered within their potential unique scenarios. Noam, anything you want to add before we open the floor?
No, thank you. That was great. I'll just add, if this slide deck will be shared, there are additional resources available throughout the NIH ecosystem of online information. I must stress sharing.nih.gov, sharing.nih.gov. That's the central NIH repository for all this information. And I have yet to find a case that I couldn't find an answer for there. Specifically, I want to highlight this FAQ in the website. They have really compiled a really good list of frequently asked questions that many of you may run into. We highly recommend you check it out because they have short, pithy answers with links to relevant resources. And also, there are many webinars on that same website that I just showed you, sharing.nih.gov, that there's a page on that website that provides educational resources, including webinars and additional information you're welcome to sign onto. Thank you.
Well, thanks a million, guys. That was absolutely fantastic. Could I ask you guys while we're doing Q&A, can you put the slide up with the QR codes again, just so people can flash those real quick? So, so I have a few questions, but we have one. Thanks, that's perfect. So we have one question. Many pediatric research perform qualitative studies or surveys. Do these need to be shared? There are concerns with confidentiality. Tom, no.
So I'll kick it off. So I do want to just draw that, make the point that whether it's quantitative or qualitative, if it's research data, the policy applies to it. So I want to make that comment. In terms of the confidentiality, that's exactly the point that I was kind of trying to get at in terms of like the access and use considerations. And so would just encourage you to kind of dig more into some of the resources that we shared there. And the bottom line is the goal of the policy is to promote sharing as much as possible while protecting confidentiality. So, it's hard to get into details, that kind of thing, but looking at ways of de-identifying as best you can while maintaining the utility of the data. But again, the devil's often in the details. Encourage you to kind of again look into the resources, and your program officers again may also be able to provide some additional guidance on that as well. Anybody else on the panel want to add to that?
Well, I guess I was thinking, based on what you had said earlier, is that, if your data or qualitative data are coded, then what you could do is share the codes for the qualitative data as well as the training and definition of the codes that you had developed as metadata. And that would be what you did. I know that other people with qualitative data have also segmented the data. So in other words, so you can't identify, it won't work for all data, but if you are able to kind of chop up your qualitative data into meaningful segments that were used to produce the codes that you had, then you can kind of chop up one person's response into bits where you wouldn't be able to kind of have all of the information from one participant all out there as a whole. That may not work for all data, but that's at least the possibility.
I'll just add one more thing to that. Thank you, Christy and Tom. And exactly as they said, the key here is to maximize data sharing. The policy, of course, allows for those unique situations where we cannot share data due to certain exempt situations, and those are listed in the policy. And there's a place, especially if you use the template, and that's why we really want people to use the template, because there's a place there where you can say, okay, this is all the types of data I'm collecting in my research, and here are all the types of data from the list above that I'm going to share, and those that I cannot share. It would really make the process easier and the back and forth with your PO if you just don't just say we're not sharing, but say why. It doesn't have to be a long explanation. But we had cases, where we had research involving substance use disorders and other cases where there was or very small population that couldn't be anonymized, where we were provided that details, and that was fine. We're not trying to make life hard. We just want to understand the reasoning behind the selection of which data will be shared and which will not.
I can tell you in the rare disease research community, this is a real big deal because people, obviously, it's pretty easy to, reconstruct who that person is with just a few pieces of information. However, many people want to share their data in the rare disease research community. And so there's, I think, one thing I would also suggest is working with, hopefully people are working with their advocacy groups and figuring out how to do this. And then, as you guys said, there are things you can put behind you can protect as well. So it's complicated, but I think, examining the needs of the community is really important too. Obviously, you don't want to reveal anyone's identity, but it's in child neurology, in pediatric neuroscience research, we do a lot of rare diseases. And so this is not an uncommon scenario. Great, that was wonderful. Okay, more really good questions. So next one, if you are partnering with a private company, how does that change the data sharing policy or inventions that are based on data collected with support from a grant?
So maybe the one thing I need to kick it off is the policy applies to work that NIH has funded in whole or in part. So you do need to consider this data as being falling within the data management sharing policy. But this is a great question, and it's a tricky one. And so I think we can just kind of start with exactly building off of what Noam had just shared, is that the goal is to maximize data sharing, but there can be acceptable reasons to limit sharing or to delay sharing, and that can include some cases involving intellectual property as well. And so there actually is an FAQ about this on the NIH, is it sharing.nih.gov, I believe is the website, that kind of gives examples to where, it, again, just like Noam mentioned, describe this in your data management sharing plan, that this specific data is being considered by, it's part of a collaboration with a private company. There are IP considerations. We estimate that the IP could be secured at some period and would plan to share it after that kind of thing. That could be one way of trying to address this. Noam, I think you might have more experience with this than I do as well. Anything you want to add or clarify on that?
Sure, just very briefly, and then if Christy wants to add. So it's really important I'll try to describe it this way. What we're trying to do with this policy, I think, in a great deal, is just kind of invert the pyramid of not sharing anything except these little things, to now we are sharing everything except these particular types of data that we can't, and here are the reasons why. So, like Tom mentioned, it doesn't matter the level of support, the relative level of support that is from NIH funded resources, as long as this is government money that's funding the research in any portion, then the data has to be shared, period. Now, there are exemptions for data, for research that involves third parties, for example. If you have an agreement with a third party to use some kind of resource they're using, or potentially a potential IP, or a plan to submit a patent application, that is fine. You just have to, in the data management and sharing plan, outline these cases. And again, it is the case that even research that involves potential IP or patent application, many times you can still share a lot of the research data that's collected and just withhold some of the specific data that will be used for the application. Having said that, I also want to add that there was a worry that people would just use this as a generic kind of reason not to share data. And therefore, it's really important to bring in your Office of Technology Transfer, if you have at your institution, early on into the discussion, and provide any documentations you have that shows that there's a commercialization plan or a plan to submit a patent application to support any exemption you're seeking from data sharing.
Thanks. I suspect that increasingly that material transfer agreements are going to start reflecting some of this as well. And that's going to, I think actually this is probably the most challenging time right now, when a lot of what's being produced was not originated under those policy, with this policy in mind. And hopefully it's going to get better over the next, 5 years or so.
Adam, if I can just add on to that quick, this is also linked on the sharing.nih.gov webpage, but there are some groups that are working to develop like data transfer use templates. And actually, so the Federal Demonstration Project, if anyone is familiar with that, is like collaboration between institutions and the government. They actually have an example template of that. So I think we are moving to try, I think that's a great point, Adam. And we are moving to try to give people resources to build on that, just to put that out there.
Great. All right. Next question, is the data management and sharing plan taken into account when making funding decisions, or is it only considered after funding decisions are made?
You want to take that one, Tom, or do you want me to?
Yeah, go ahead, Noam.
Yeah, so reviewers do not see the data management and sharing plan. This part of the application is reviewed by program, so by your program officers or by the relevant clusters or divisions at NINDS. An award cannot be made per the policy, per the grant policy, until the data management and sharing plan is approved and meets the policy. So that's as close of a definitive answer I could give you. We cannot award any money until it's compliant with the policy. I just would emphasize, work early on with your program officers for any questions or issues, including commercialization, et cetera. But it's not being reviewed and scored by reviewers, except for any budget justifications. But the actual DMS plan is reviewed for adequacy and compliance by the program staff and is a part of the checklist they have to approve before any grants are distributed. Did I get that right, Tom?
That was perfectly stated. No,
okay.
Thank you.
So new phrase, post-review pre-award is where this sits.
And, we're looking at a lot of other things at that stage too. That's where we're making sure that human subjects, there's no concerns there, vertebrate animals. So that has always kind of existed, resource sharing. This just also fits in there as well. And we're always looking for how to make that work at that step.
Great. What about voice recording and videos?
That's a great question. So voice recordings and videos can be used across many disease domains and in many types of research conducted. And I think I would divide that, and my answer at least, and I'd love input from the panel. So I think that there are less issues if we're talking about data derived from videos or voice recordings. So if you're using that as kind of a source data from which you code or you categorize it into other data you're using, then I think there are less issues with sharing that coded, anonymized data. If the actual video recording or audio recording is kind of the primary research data that you're using to either develop a tool or any other reason, then yes, it falls under the list of research data that should be shared. And of course, if you're going to do that, we need to think about issues of privacy concerns, anonymization, and also the logistics of sharing these types of media in a way that could be usable by the community. It could be that only portions need to be shared. It could be segmented. It really depends on the type of specific research that we're talking about. And again, this would be a great opportunity, if you are using this type of data, to contact your program officer early and start dialogue with them about what's the best way to approach sharing this type of data if it's important for the research. But I'd love some other inputs as well.
I mean, it's a challenge to be sure. If you're talking about video, like video EEG data,
Mhm.
that's, that's identifiable. But it depends on what you're doing with those data. You could potentially, I would imagine, code that in a certain way that then could be where you've de-identified it. But it's going to be a challenge. I think we're going to have to get a little more experience with some of this before we come up with a firm policy on certain parts of it. So great. Another question. I wonder how we can control. So this is a two-part question. We'll just do one at a time. I wonder how we can control the quality of the data we share. For example, for MRI and nuclear medicine, data is very important to control a lot of variables. So how do you control data quality?
So I'll give it a quick stab, and I think that I think this is where the repository comes in, selecting a repository that's appropriate. Really, the rule of thumb for NIH is you should select a repository where the data is most likely to be used, right? So this is within your communities. And this approach has several advantages. One of the important ones in my mind is that these repositories are also the ones most likely to employ the standards, data standards and quality standards that are most useful for this type of methodology you're using or in your field. So I can just give some examples. There's the Open Neuro repository as well as the NIMH Data Archive repository. And I'm just giving those, there are many others, but I'm just giving those as examples to repositories where some level of quality control that's agreed upon within the field is employed at the point of data upload, right? They will require certain actions, there'll be certain quality control measures looked at when you upload the data. These repositories also then, match an identifier to that data and so forth. So there's really a lot of benefits for using one of those repositories. But yes, data control is very important, and that's why we ask that standards and the metadata used to the extent possible be outlined in the DMS plans.
And I'll just add, for some types of studies, quality control is frequently something that reviewers will comment on, because it's not just a data sharing issue, it's actually an analysis issue too. And so that's really important. There might be missing data that really, and actually some of our funding opportunities specifically ask reviewers to comment on quality control and handling missing data and things like that. Next part of that question, do we need to have the permission of our institution besides the consent of the patient and anonymization of the data? So does the institution need to provide permission for data sharing?
I think for that, the thing that's coming to my mind is just kind of follow your institutional procedures and protocols is kind of maybe the best thing I can think of to say. I don't know, Noam or anybody else have anything to add to that?
Sure. So I think that's part of what the IRBs are looking at, probably, and there should be specific guidance for any office of sponsored research at any institute about this. So it might vary from institute to institute, the exact procedure, but usually they will be involved. So the data management and sharing plan becomes part of your notice of award, which is kind of an official grant financial and business document that your institute endorses. So therefore, they're involved at least at that level and endorse the plan.
And so this is also falls under the material transfer agreement issue, because someone from your institution has to sign off. Supposedly someone's also signing off from your institution on the grant application. And I would imagine, although it always helps to ask, I think, only because they might not be paying attention to certain things.
And
so
some, they may be in different offices,
right,
and that kind of thing. So I think you're right on, Adam.
Right. It's I think, and again, I also think this is an evolving sort of a space. In a couple of years, people are going to probably hopefully they've already added it to checklists of some sort or another. But
and actually, Adam, maybe one more thing to add to that is what's often been kind of mentioned at NIH is that your biomedical librarian can also be a good resource for some of this. That might be particularly in like repository selection, that kind of thing. But just to highlight that there are likely individuals at your institution in tech transfer office, sponsored project office, but also like your biomedical librarian that could be tremendous resources for you and are probably great places to start.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and actually many librarians have actually changed their title to informaticist because they're not just cataloging books anymore.
Yep.
It's much more complicated than that. Well, that's wonderful. My the only question I had was I could see it'd be a little bit tricky how we can only provide funds during the period of award, and yet there's ongoing data storage. And so you would imagine that there are going to be some interesting looking contracts where you say you're going to pay us up front for X number of years of storage. And it's really, I think, up to the institution and to the individual to make sure that that contract's executed properly after the funding award period. The funding period's over because we're kind of out of it at that point, right? Did you guys want to comment at all on that? Have you seen any scenarios where things didn't go as planned yet?
So I can just very briefly, what I know is that one aspect of the FAIR principles and of the list of NIH endorsed repositories is they're really looking at the sustainability of these repositories as one of the characteristics they evaluate. And by sustainability, I mean, does this repository or organization that sponsor it have a plan, long-term plan to how the data will be stored and how will this be covered, both logistically in terms of offsite in case of disaster and so forth, but also in terms of the funding and what happens if there is no funding and contingency plans. So again, the repositories on that list and on the NINDS data sharing list, which there's a link to in the QRs, they all went through this vetting, so you don't have to. So at a minimum, if you go to these repositories under their About page or somewhere thereabouts, you will find information about the sustainability of the repository and how they support long-term storage of the data. But yes, Adam, you're absolutely right. This is something that we expect a lot more discussion to happen in the upcoming couple of years. Yeah.
Fantastic. Christy, any final comments, questions before I close this out?
I think we addressed the things that I thought might come up. Unless I'm forgetting anything, but thank you so much. This has been fantastic. And I learn something every time I hear you guys talk about this.
Me too. Yeah. So I'll add my thanks and exactly, I was thinking exactly the same thing, Christy. Every time these guys present, something new comes up that I hadn't thought of before. And so this has been extremely informative to us as well. I'll add, we actually had a number of NINDS intramural people on as well. So I think it speaks to how good and informative you guys are. So just as a reminder, everyone, the session was recorded. It's going to be transcribed and then archived on the NINDS website in the coming weeks. And then details about where to find the archived versions will be posted on social media and professional society listservs and newsletters. And so with that, have a wonderful weekend, everyone. And we will be in touch soon about the next episode of the webinars on challenges in pediatric neuroscience research. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.